Hey guys, let's go ahead and we are going to practice some secondary source short answers with time period number 3, which remember goes from 1754, which is when we see the beginnings of the French and Indian War, all the way up to 1800 after the United States have had some time to establish themselves. So as we look at these secondary sources, remember to think of our friend Abe. We love Abe because Abe is going to show us how to argue these questions that we're going to see. Because remember that A always provides the answer, and he always provides support for his argument, which is through his because statement, and also because he gives examples to back them up. And remember that in secondary short questions, A is always looking for that answer, which typically is the difference between the two secondary sources. And then you have to give the argument, which means you have to say because. And so you have to give the because of why the argument that they're making. And then questions B and C is really looking for those examples that we're looking for. So let's look and see how this could be argued and what this would look like here. So this is a perfect example of a secondary source that your first question is going to look like. You can see right here that they've got our two secondary sources. But before we get into the secondary source, we always want to look at question A, because remember that question A has some clues. First of all, we want to see if they're looking at a difference or a similarity between these two historians. And most of the time it's going to be a difference. And so the nice thing about a difference is it gives us a clue. And typically what happens is one of these is going to be an easier read. So let's say you're reading through these two secondary sources and you can figure out Mayer's argument right off the bat. But Nash's seem a little vague and you're still like, I'm not quite sure what they're asking. Well, once again, we know this is a difference, and so we can then assume that if we know Mayer's argument, we can look at the second one with a different perspective of thinking, is it arguing the opposite? And usually that pops out their argument pretty well. So in this case, we are looking for a difference. And then the other clue we want to look at is we want to look at what is the topic of this secondary source. And we like to look at this first because it gives us a roadmap for what we're looking for. And it looks like what we're looking for is the origins of the American Revolution. So that's the topic that we're going to be focusing on, is where did the American Revolution start? And we're going to look at these two historians to see what their argument is. And we can assume they're different. And so in our answers, we're going to have the answer, which is the difference. But remember, Abe is never satisfied with just an answer. We have to explain what their argument is. So we're going to use our magical word of because to kind of give further elements for that. And then Abe also likes to have examples, which is really what question B and C is looking for, which is, once again, give a historical event or development. That's an example. Give a historical event that supports them. And so we're going to look at how these could be written from there. Now, right now, if you want to pause and if you want to go through the secondary sources and get a feel for it and try it out, that's perfectly fine. We're going to delve right into what this would look like for writing as we use the strategy of Abe to write it. But if you'd like to pause and get a kind of a feel for how this is going to work, that's great too. So we're going to look at how we could write this out. And remember that question A wants to know what was the difference between Nash's and Mayer's argument over the origins of the American Revolution. And so that's going to be our answer. But we have to provide their argument. And so we have to give their answer and because it's going to explain how it is. And then question B and C are going to look at examples that can back up those arguments. And so they're elements of Abe that we can see in here first. So let's go ahead and look at an answer for question A and see if you can find the answer and see if you can find the argument through the use of the magical word because. So this person wrote, Nash and Mayer differ in their opinion on where the revolution began. Nash argues the origins of the American Revolution began in colonial cities because, as they changed to major trade centers, the views on governments began to change. However, Mayer argues the origins of the American Revolution began in ideas centered in the Anglo-American politics, long established in the colonies, because the colonies were fighting for access to British rights rather than new ideas. So can you see the answer? First of all, the answer here is the difference is where the revolution began. So that was immediately in the answer. And then they said Nash argues that it began in the colonial cities. But remember, they're arguing something. So we just can't say one thing and assume that's an argument. So we have this magical word because if you read through Nash's, he talks about how the city's changed, and because the city's changed, that's where we see a change in philosophies over government. And so we have this argument that Nash is making. But we also have to argue Mayer's. So we can see here in our answer that Mayer argues that it began in the ideas of the Anglo-American politics. And then he says further, because it wasn't just that the ideas existed, it was because the colonists were fighting for access to those rights rather than new ideas. And so we can see kind of two differences where one person is saying, look, it began because the cities were changing. And you see another person saying, no, 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 it began in these ideas that came over with the colonists as they came over from Britain. So questions B and E want to be good Abe people and want to provide examples to back that up. So let's look at some examples that could back up their arguments and how we restate their arguments. So question B says, one event from 1754 to 1800 that supports Nash's argument that the changes in the cities was in the origins of the American Revolution was the formation of the Continental Congress. So here is our example. But remember, we have to argue our example. And so we got to give further details as to how this fits with their argument. So it says the First and Second Continental Congress met in the colonial city of Philadelphia. This illustrates that the leaders of the American independence movement met in cities where they could find support for their radical ideas. This supports Nash's arguments that change occurred in cities where the ideas would be adopted and accepted. Do you feel like this person did a good aid? Provided the answer, provided support for the argument, and provided the example to back it up, right? Are you convinced about Nash's? Well, let's see if we can convince you of Myers. So question C says, one development from 1754 to 1800 that supports Myers' argument that the origin of the American Revolution began in the Anglo-American political tradition was the argument of natural rights in the Declaration of Independence. Here's our example. Okay. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence using British philosopher John Locke's ideas of natural rights. This illustrates that as they claimed their independence, they used the tradition of British ideas to support their argument, which aligns with Myers' argument of the origins of American Revolution starting in the Anglo-American tradition. So remember that we're using Abe, we provide our answers. In question A, we give our because we're giving the arguments that they're giving. And then question B and C is finding those examples to back up the arguments that are made. And so you can see how they give the example, give a little bit more detail, and then restate the argument that is made. All right, now it's your turn. You're going to practice this up. You're going to have two historians. Remember, you want to look at question A because we're going to look if it's a similarity or if it's a difference. And you're going to look at the topic. And then you can use those to guide you through your two secondary sources. And then you can provide their argument. So remember for A, your answer is going to be the difference. We're providing an argument, so then you have to explain for each of them what their argument is. Like, why are they saying that that's their answer? And then for B and C, you'll be giving those examples to back up the arguments here. Good luck.